Most people treat emotion as something that leaks on uncontrollable spill. They either try to repress or display openly, hoping to be understood. But Machiavelli approached emotion not as a problem to manage, but as a tool to wield. Where others were steered by their feelings, he directed his own end, the emotions of others like threads on a puppet. Tug one, restrain another, and observe how people react. He wasn't devoid of feeling. He was deliberately emotional. This approach, rarely discussed, wasn't rooted in cold detachment. It was based on deliberate warmth, calculated vulnerability, controlled intensity, and finely tuned expressions of sentiment. He used these emotional signals to amass influence, build alliances, and dismantle resistance. In essence, he was a master manipulator of emotion and emotional puppeteer. And this remains one of his most underrated weapons. Because what's more disarming than someone who appears deeply touched? What's more convincing than someone who seems authentically sincere? And what's more dangerous than a person who can cry, confess, and display weakness without believing any of it? This isn't speculation, it's historical record. Take the Prince, for example. In his dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici, Machiavelli doesn't start with bravado, tactics, or declarations of power. He begins with humility, writing, "I hope it will not be considered presumptuous that a man of lowly and humble condition should speak of princely governance." Why begin this way? Because he understood that presenting yourself as inferior is often the quickest route past someone's defenses. Power isn't manipulated through pride, it's manipulated through intentional vulnerability. This is the heart of emotional puppeteering. Express when useful, unveil when it stings, neutralize when it buys you time, and let every emotional gesture serve as bait. So how did this play out not in politics, but in human interaction? Machiavelli served under Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander V, a leader known for both brilliance and brutality. When Borgia took power, Machiavelli didn't oppose him, nor did he attempt to win favor through intellectual prowess. Instead, he attuned himself emotionally. He echoed Borgia's ambition, boosted his ego, and praised his ruthless cleverness. He wrote admiringly of Borgia's capacity to deceive and dominate. But that admiration masked a deeper strategy. Machiavelli wasn't intimidated, he was observant. Through flattery, he drew near. Through apparent loyalty, he disappeared into the background. And by making his emotional intentions legible, "I recognize your genius, I admire it, I defer to it," he ensured he would never be perceived as a threat. This forms the foundation of emotional manipulation. People don't protect themselves against those who reflect their emotions. When you mirror someone's internal state, you bypass their defenses. If they're angry, respond with concern. If they're enthusiastic, offer admiration. If they're uneasy, synchronize with their tempo. They won't detect your influence because they feel understood. That's where manipulation truly begins, not through control, but through emotional resonance. Machiavelli applied this repeatedly in diplomatic roles. When representing Florence to other city-states, he didn't lead with political power. He led with empathy. He wrote extensive insights into how each city's leaders functioned emotionally, their patterns, their pride, their sensitivity to slights. Every message he delivered, every pause he took, every gesture he made was designed not merely with reason, but with emotional precision. He was charting responses before making decisions. Because when you understand what someone wants to feel, you know exactly how to guide them. This brings us to the second level of the method. Manage your emotional presentation not to conceal the truth, but to craft the reality others respond to. It's a subtle psychological illusion most people never catch. Machiavelli recognized that if you show tears, others will feel sympathy. If you hesitate, they feel tension. If you remain calm, they feel off balance. And if your emotional signals shift unpredictably, you generate confusion. And confusion is the space where persuasion turns into control. When people are uncertain, they gravitate toward the one who seems most emotionally steady. If that person is you, even if your composure is manufactured, your dominance becomes real. Machiavelli referred to this as managing fortune. Not fate, not randomness, but the power to influence others' perception of reality by mastering your emotional display. It's like performing not in the sense of deception, but in choosing the emotional version of yourself that best fits the moment. Not because you're insincere, but because real power is the ability to remain emotionally untrapped. Now, here's where it becomes even more dangerous, where Machiavelli took the method further. He didn't merely use his own emotions. He turned other people's emotions into weapons. He would spot the insecure figure in a meeting and offer feedback just vague enough to seed self-doubt. He'd compliment a rival just enough to inflate their ego until they became overconfident and reckless. He would lift expectations during negotiation, then suddenly pull away, leaving others confused, chasing certainty they hadn't even known they craved. He knew that emotions don't just expose people, they drive them. And once someone's feelings are in motion, you don't resist them, you guide them. You fuel their pride. You stroke their anxiety. You mirror their frustration. You empathize with their confusion. And while they ride that emotional momentum, you embed your suggestions. This is emotional puppeteering in its most subtle form. And the average person, they'll say, he just gets people, or she's so sincere, she really knows how to connect. But it's not intuition. It's not even empathy. It's technique, strategic emotional control. Machiavelli wasn't charming in the modern sense. He didn't win people over with smiles. He studied emotion like a predator surveys terrain, reading every height, every shadow, every angle. Because when you understand what someone needs to feel, you don't just sway them, you own them. You're not the most dominant person in the room because you speak the loudest. You're dominant because you regulate the emotional undercurrent without ever revealing its origin. That's the puppeteer's edge. And in a culture obsessed with self-expression, it's still one of the most powerful and most overlooked forms of control. Because today, people are told to be transparent, to share their truth, to bear their emotions. And when someone does that, when they openly reveal their emotions, they unknowingly hand over the blueprint to their inner world, their needs, insecurities, and breaking points. But a puppeteer reveals nothing, yet controls everything. Machiavelli would have thrived in today's complex power dynamics for one fundamental reason. He recognized that emotion shortcuts logic. You can refute facts, but you can't argue someone out of how they feel. So how did he use this insight? He didn't wield emotion to win debates. He used it to guide people gently toward agreement, bypassing resistance entirely. Let's translate this into a modern situation. Picture a political figure engaged in delicate, behind-the-scenes negotiations. The opposing side is composed, detached, strictly formal. Most negotiators would respond in kind, assuming that logic and data will prevail. But Machiavelli would employ a different strategy. He would disrupt that emotional tone. He might lower his voice, then tell a personal anecdote about loss, betrayal, or the burden of legacy, just intimate enough to shift the room's energy. He'd make himself appear the most human presence at the table. Why? Because when you are the first to share emotion purposefully, you trigger recalibration. The others begin to feel. And once feelings are involved, numbers lose their weight. Logic fades as people become emotionally unsettled, caught between the desire to mirror your vulnerability or escape it. Either way, you win. If they open up, you've established rapport. If they recoil, you've thrown them off balance. This is what Machiavelli described as the creation of asymmetry, when your adversary no longer knows how to situate themselves because you've entered through a door they never watched. Their reasoning begins to fracture. Suddenly, they're weighing emotion, authority, image, and outcome all at once. You've split their internal focus, and now you can begin to guide it. That's what a puppeteer does. They don't overwhelm, they disrupt clarity. Here's another real tactic Machiavelli used: purposeful silence after emotional display. After showing a glimpse of vulnerability, he would pull back, not abruptly, but subtly, just enough to let the silence stretch, to make the other person sit in it. And people despise emotional silence. They rush to fill it with affirmations, offers, reassurances, and in doing so, they lay themselves bare. This is how you turn emotion into a tactical asset, not by acting it out, but by placing it where it carries the most weight. Machiavelli was playing emotional chess, while everyone else was still learning the pieces. Now, let's talk about power structures. Emotional influence only succeeds when you grasp how individuals assign emotional value. A soldier is moved by bravery, a diplomat by dignity, a ruler by legacy, a citizen by justice. So if you want to manipulate them, you don't showcase your feelings, you reflect theirs, in a mirror they can't ignore. Machiavelli didn't say, "Here's what I believe." He said, "Here's what I know you feel." He painted their emotional landscape for them using their terminology, their values, their inner cracks. So by the time they responded, they were already functioning within the emotional framework Machiavelli had quietly constructed. Take this striking example from The Prince. He writes, "A man who wishes to always act virtuously will inevitably be ruined among so many who are not good." This isn't just a caution, it's emotional provocation. It's deliberately crafted to stir discomfort, to make the reader question their idealism, their softness. And once that internal tension sets in, they're prepared for the deeper, darker message underneath. Therefore, one must learn how not to be good when the situation requires it. That's the shift. He leverages emotional conflict, the shame of innocence, the fear of fragility to steer the reader toward cold pragmatism. That's not persuasion, it's psychological programming. You feel unease, you want to resolve it. He offers the resolution. You accept it believing it's your own choice. But it never was. And here's where it gets even more sophisticated. A true emotional puppeteer doesn't just influence people one-on-one, they orchestrate how people react to each other. When Machiavelli walked into a council of leaders and wanted someone isolated, he didn't attack them directly. He shifted emotional attention. He'd lightly commend someone else's insight just enough to trigger quiet jealousy. He might laugh with a rival supporter just enough to hint at closeness. He'd make a subtle remark about a past betrayal not as an accusation, but as a gentle observation and leave it hanging. Suddenly, the room is emotionally destabilized. Paranoia creeps in. Everyone begins to reassess their alliances. Yet Machiavelli hasn't raised his voice or taken a side. All he's done is tilt the emotional balance. This is how the puppeteer remains invisible. They never seem like the cause of the emotions they awaken. They stay poised, composed, quietly watching as others twist and reposition themselves around the tension that was so carefully planted. It's not Malisate's design. And once you begin to see this, you understand. Most people aren't playing the game at this level. They're simply reacting, explaining, defending. But those who ascend, they master what Machiavelli perfected: long agonized control over people, but control over how people feel when they're in your presence. This is why the most dangerous individuals are rarely the most volatile and rarely the most indifferent. They operate in the emotional middle. One moment, they're cold and sharp. The next, disarmingly warm. 1 minute, they compliment you. The next, they challenge you. They are unpredictable enough because they're unstable, but because they are strategically inconsistent. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. The more emotionally consistent you are, the easier you are to manipulate. But if others can't forecast your response, they can't prepare against you. That's what made him so dangerous. He could be curt in private, gracious in public, ruthless in policy, and yet tender in his writing. His emotional range wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon, a mask he could shift at will. In The Prince, he doesn't advocate for stoic detachment. He doesn't say, "Always be emotionless." Instead, he writes, "A prince must be a skilled pretender and dissembler." Oh, that word dissembler is key. It means concealing one's true self behind a calculated emotional performance, to reveal everything while letting none of it own you. That's emotional contradiction as strategy. When you defy people's expectations not just once, but repeatedly, you destabilize their sense of predictability. And once that predictability dissolves, they stop planning and start reacting. Here's what that looks like in a modern context. Imagine you're the leader of a team. Typically, you're disciplined, direct, uphold high standards, and remain emotionally neutral. That's what everyone expects. Then one day, without warning, you reveal something personal. Perhaps a story that shook you. You share it calmly, not dramatically, then return to your usual firmness. What just happened? You disrupted the emotional script. Now your team begins reevaluating everything they thought they knew. Is he more layered than we assumed? Is he more emotionally aware than he lets on? Did we miss how deeply he's watching? Now, you're no longer just a title, they feel your presence. And presence is harder to manage than position. That's exactly what Machiavelli did, repeatedly. Even in his writings, he displayed this contrast. His letters to friends were light-hearted, witty, even self-critical. But his political prose? Sharp, cold, ruthless. Why? Because emotional contrast sharpens focus. Constant intensity becomes background noise. Consistent calm is mistaken for detachment. But when someone oscillates merging softness with severity, approachability with command, you become unforgettable. That's what Machiavelli aimed for, not admiration, but emotional vigilance. He didn't want comfort in his presence. He wanted alertness. Because comfort leads to sloppy behavior. Uncertainty keeps people sharp. Now here's a lesser-known rule of the puppeteer's art. You don't need to control everyone. You only need to disrupt the emotional equilibrium of the right person. Machiavelli didn't waste energy trying to sway crowds through emotion. He zoomed in on the key influence point. He watched closely. Who do others glance at before answering? Who holds silent authority? Then he'd emotionally engage that person. Maybe with a change in tone, a quiet comment, a contradiction that threw them slightly off center, just enough to shift the entire room's mood. Because emotion is contagious. Influence the central figure, and the rest follow. That's how the puppeteer operates in the background. And if you think this is just historical theory, you're mistaken. Today's most effective public figures, top executives, charismatic speakers, online personalities use this strategy constantly. They seem emotionally open during interviews, vulnerable, modest, expressive, but behind the scenes, they are calculating, composed, even cold. They twist expectations, and in that contradiction, they create mystique and control. People obsess over decoding them. They wonder, when are they being authentic? But here's the truth. There is no authentic, only what's effective. That's what Machiavelli understood perfectly. He didn't subscribe to a fixed emotional identity. He practiced strategic emotional flexibility. He allowed himself to feel, but only revealed what the situation demanded. He cared, but never at the cost of clarity. And when he needed to influence someone, he didn't rely on argument-used feeling. He displayed just enough emotion to make others drop their defenses, question themselves, or draw closer to him. That's where emotional contradiction becomes a tool for control, a tool for obedience. People don't fear what they fully grasp. They fear what they almost grasp but can't quite anticipate. If you're always calm, they'll try to shake you. If you're always harsh, they'll attempt to soften you. But if you alternate between tenderness and severity, they stop trying altogether. They just observe. They hesitate. They second guess. At that point, you're not leading through force, you're leading through presence. Machiavelli would call this the illusion of depth, the perception that you hold more layers than anyone else in the room, even if you don't. Because once people believe you're deep, they stop seeing you as a competitor and start treating you as the environment itself. Influence fades, control slips, but dependence endures. Machiavelli understood that the most potent form of emotional power wasn't domination, it was building dependence without exerting force. This is where true manipulation lies, not in overt control, but in silent emotional agreements people commit to without knowing. Most people assume control comes from fear, from hierarchy. But Machiavelli often flipped this script. He would win people over through emotional attentiveness, well-timed empathy, or a moment of sincere understanding, and then create distance, just enough to make others come back looking for more. This is the fourth layer of the emotional puppeteer strategy. Offer emotional safety once, then withdraw it, not as punishment, but as positioning. When someone feels profoundly seen by you, Even briefly, it creates a powerful illusion. They understand me. They get me. And once that impression is formed, people unconsciously start seeking your approval. They adjust their tone, their body language, their behavior just to stay close to your emotional center. At this point, you're not just a presence, you've become their emotional reference point. And the brilliance of this tactic lies in its subtlety. You don't shower them with praise. You don't respond in expected ways. Instead, you remain silent, pulling back just enough to create unease. That void, your absence, becomes a trigger. They begin chasing. They try to win back your attention, to reclaim a connection they believe they lost. Machiavelli employed this technique masterfully in diplomacy. He would write personal, warm, and respectful letters describing not just political strategy, but emotional insight. He expressed admiration, even affection. He built resonance and mutual understanding. Then he'd abruptly stop writing. And in the silence, people revealed more. They responded eagerly, vulnerably, emotionally. They wanted to restore the bond. They wanted to be acknowledged again. This is how you ensnare without threats. You create a feeling they cravened, then let them chase it. Because once someone is emotionally pursuing you, they stop evaluating your worth logically. They begin trying to restore an emotional balance that you control. This is emotional leverage, and it applies across every kind of relationship. In personal dynamics, you listen with intensity. You connect. You share something real. Then you retreat. They lean in. In negotiation, you give sincerely and generously at first. Then, just when they expect a yes, you pause. And that hesitation, it makes them give more to maintain the emotional tone you've already set. In team settings, when you genuinely affirm someone's viewpoint, the next time you hesitate before responding, they begin actively seeking your agreement, not because you imposed authority, but because they once felt recognized. Machiavelli grasped this dynamic long before it became standard in leadership psychology. But he didn't just use emotional investment to keep people involved, he used it to render them predictable. Because a person striving for your emotional approval becomes remarkably easy to decode. They expose their doubts. They reiterate their points. They explain too much. When they sense detachment, they speak more cautiously, lingering after uncertain remarks, watching your face for cues. You become their mirror, but it's a manipulated reflection. Every look you give, every silence you offer, becomes a signal they try to decipher. They try to align with what they think you want, how they think you feel, where they believe you stand. And in that effort, they stop thinking independently. They stop planning. They begin reacting to you. That's when the power dynamic reverses. You're no longer seeking their approval, they're trying not to lose yours. This is the Machiavellian inversion. Control masked as kindness. Most people misuse this technique. They pretend to be emotionally engaged. But Machiavelli's brilliance was in making his emotional expressions feel authentic, not because he faked them, but because he chose which truths to unveil. He wasn't indifferent, they was intentionally warm. He shared just enough of his humanity to build trust, but never so much that it could be turned against him. He didn't conceal who he curated which version others could access. That's the distinction between a weapon left in plain sight and one revealed at the exact moment it's needed, timing, contrast, and control. That's the difference between manipulation and mastery. And now, the final trap. Let them think they're steering you. Machiavelli frequently allowed people to believe they had persuaded him. He would nod thoughtfully, rephrase a sentence, concede a minor detail. He made others feel smart, respected, and influential, but the truth? His course had already been set. He understood that few things bind a person more deeply than the belief they've influenced you. That belief sparks pride, and emotional pride builds faster than trust. When someone thinks, he listened to me, I had an impact, I shaped that outcome, they begin to emotionally invest in your narrative. They defend it, they reinforce it, they promote it to others. Even if they were never truly in control, they feel a sense of ownership. And ownership is loyalty in disguise. By the time they realized their influence was an illusion, They're already commit-already part of the structure you created, already rationalizing your actions to others, caught in an emotional current they can't fully explain. That's how Machiavelli secured allegiance senat through threats. But by transforming emotional cues into behavioral bonds, he forged alliances where others thought they were building friendships. The puppeteer doesn't rely on pressure. He moves through emotion. And by the time you realize you're part of the act, the strings are already set. And this wasn't the peak of Machiavelli's power. His manipulation of individual emotion was only the beginning. What made Machiavelli truly dangerous wasn't just his skill in guiding conversations, it was his capacity to shape entire emotional ecosystems that favored him, even when he wasn't present. He didn't just influence individuals, he designed atmospheres. Because once you understand not just how people respond to you, but how they emotionally react to each other, you stop needing to manage every detail. Instead, you build emotional structures that repeat patterns automatically, systems that run on feeling, not commands. This is where his brilliance became structural rather than personal. Consider the courts he advised, the councils he influenced, the institutions he analyzed. He wasn't merely concerned with authority, law, or hierarchy. He zeroed in on emotional cues. What makes someone afraid to speak up? What fuels the need to stay close to power? Which rewards feel personal even when small? Which punishments hurt most, even if symbolic? Because true stability comes not from rules but from internalized emotions. When people regulate their behavior not out of obligation, but out of emotional conditioning, you've achieved something far deeper than control. Machiavelli saw this clearly in the rise of Cesare Borgiano, just in his acts of violence or betrayal, but in the emotional climate he created. No one knew who held favor, who was next to fall, or what loyalty might cost. And yet everyone scrambled to display it. It wasn't sheer terror, it was emotional volatility. He created a system where people couldn't find balance, so they compensated by becoming more obedient, more performative, more desperate to please. This is emotional puppeteering at its peak. When people begin to believe that their worth, identity, or survival depends on navigating an emotional standard that never stays still. Once they buy into that, you don't need to issue commands. They self-regulate to maintain the illusion. We see this dynamic everywhere today. In companies where leaders never offer direct feedback, so employees read into every glance. In social circles where silence is a form of exclusion and attention is transactional. In families where love is inconsistent, so grown children spend their lives trying to earn something they never quite received. That's not disarray. That's an emotional economy. And someone is always profiting. Machiavelli knew this instinctively. When emotion becomes scarce, attention becomes currency. When approval is limited, loyalty becomes obsessive. When understanding is conditional, people reveal everything just to feel seen. This is how empires endure, not through force, but through unspoken emotional contracts. In the end, the most faithful followers aren't the ones forced at sword point. They're the ones still waiting to be noticed, hoping to be heard, reaching for that one nod from the princeor, the puppeteer that says, "You matter." A nod that costs you nothing but binds them entirely. And once you have the power to decide when that nod comes, show where and why you no longer need armies or crowns or threats. You only need silence. You only need the pause. You only need them to feel almost. Because almost being seen is the most enduring leash of all. Once embraced, it keeps people leaning in. It makes them follow shadows. It holds them tethered to a center you no longer even need to protect. This is the final insight. Machiavelli didn't assert power through reason. He didn't rule by brute strength. He ruled by cultivating emotional dependence and then keeping just beyond reach. Because when you do that, their loyalty isn't to you, but to the feeling of needing you. And that kind of attachment is a bond no one can sever.